Maths, aesthetics, decolonization, classrooms. If you're also thinking about all of these together, chances are that you're me. Hi, I'm Ayush Mukherjee, a first-year doctoral student in the Math Education program at Simon Fraser University, and I am thinking of other ways of characterizing classrooms. Is maths an aesthetic practice? Can a maths classroom be an aesthetic environment? Accounts both by mathematicians and math educators say yes. In fact, recent literature tells us three broad ways in which aesthetic engagement can happen in maths classrooms. First, we argue that aesthetic criteria is important for maths, but that it's not given to us from the outside. Instead, as Natalie Sinclair says, aesthetic criteria depend on the person applying the criteria, the situation in which that person finds herself, or on the cultural norms and influences. Second, embodied theorists challenge the idea that aesthetic engagement is just the reflection of a distanced mind. They argue that this engagement is instead the body forming sensorial relations with the world. And third, post-structural's account of the body do not see it as something that is unified, but rather that something which is distributed into specific material arrangements in space and time. All of this calls for an aesthetic philosophy. Let's turn to that now. The dominant space-time matter arrangement should be clear to us. Think about how lesson follows lesson, how a grade follows grade, and you understand time as linear. Think of how students are seated in a conventional classroom, and you understand space as something that is grid-like or at least isometric. All of these are colonial arrangements because they relegate difference to within an abstract homogeneous schema. To come up with an anti-colonial stance of education is therefore to come up with an alternative space-time arrangement and therefore an alternative aesthetics. This is what Tagore set out to do. He thinks of the world and the self both as multiple, whose discontinuous interleaving gives us novel relations within which people create new meaning. This is the aesthetic act. Tagore's entire philosophy is based on this aesthetic conception. Now, he wasn't directly talking about mathematics classrooms, so I will. Let's be careful of our context though. Canada in 2020s is not Tagore's space and time. My research has three parts. Part 1 is to read Tagore with other philosophers and see if their work combines in new and interesting ways. The question here is, can we come up with novel organizing concepts to describe aesthetic experience in the maths classroom? Part 2 is to create perspective-based sensorial maps around participants in a middle school maths classroom in British Columbia. The question here is, can we create new diagramming practices that cohere somewhat with the concepts that we got in part 1? And part 3 is where I work with speculative theorists and ask the question, can we take Tagore really to 100 years into the future and talk about maths classrooms there? What kind of not here, not now concepts would we have to talk about then? Together, these parts will help me answer how to read, write, and interpret an alternative aesthetics in the math classroom. Thank you.